Hey guys, welcome back to Grizzly Valley. Today I'll be taking you through the beginnings of the Roman section of the park, which are actually quite similar to the Japanese section in terms of how I started doing it. I did drop the Japanese section for now since I really wanted to move on to the Roman theme, since I started an empty sandbox again, didn't save it over the Grizzly file thankfully, and decided to just give a couple more prototypes of the Roman theme really a spin and see what you can really do with it. And I only built one building and then I pretty much figured this is gonna have to be an area in the park, and that's pretty much where we are now. I want to make this area a little bit more ambitious though than the rest of the park, and in that regard I would say that I'm not a big fan of adding this in the park, and it doesn't seem to be too logical within the park since it's a much more expensive area, since I want to have a dive coaster over here as you can see, but to actually get that dive coaster to be able to go underneath the paths and have more terrain height differences, I really need to work a lot with scenery, since there isn't any terrain modification in the game in this earliest alpha version so far, which will be in the next one, but I don't have it quite yet. So everything that is raised is going to have to be scenery, so this will be a very heavy area on scenery, and realistically, if this were real life, also much more expensive than the rest of the park. So in that regard, it sort of sticks out from the rest of the park as being a probably in the end slightly more heavily themed. Although that's something that I do want to counteract somewhat by having largely foliage around this. I do want to create a sort of Roman plaza with this coaster in the middle of it, much like the Japanese plaza actually, and the major building is going to be the station of the coaster, but I do also want to have a lot of foliage around it. Now for the dive coaster itself, it's a little bit inspired by Sheikra. It's generally just a very generic dive coaster. I need to give a big shout out to TheCodemaster, who has a tutorial on his channel which you should definitely check out if you want to make a dive coaster or any B&M really, which is a tutorial on how to actually get realistic vertical drops, as well as Immelmans and Zero-G rolls, which is actually, especially the vertical drop, I had no idea about, and it's really useful of course if you want to make a dive coaster, or pretty much mandatory. And from that I really decided, well, it's something which I still wanted to try, and I really felt the Roman area would be the best area to try that in, since it sort of allows for that grid-like layout of the area, which would probably work best with having a huge gap in the middle of it where the dive coaster can dive underneath the paths. The main buildings are going to be inspired by the Forum Romanum, which is the very old central plaza of Rome back when the Romans were still there. And it's also very much laid out in a grid, and there are all sorts of temples and basilicas over there, which is not entirely what I want to make here, because obviously if I want to make something really huge like that, no theme park would be able to really actually cover the costs for that, but I do want to make something similar and make some buildings that are somewhat inspired by it. And it is going to be a pretty empty area otherwise. I didn't decide to place any rides in this area so far. I want to keep those on the ground and just make this sort of the central coaster area, much like I think you do often have these paths around dive coasters, since they're just one of the coasters which you most often find paths around just to take a look at the coaster and have some benches where you can sit down and things like that. It's basically more of an area where the coaster is almost part of the scenery and theming and things you may want to look at. So that's really the idea behind this. I do want to play around with some flat rides around it, and that's why I quickly wanted to place the hammer swing there. But before I actually move on to that, it's probably the best idea to actually do the buildings over here first and make sure this area is finished. Now a lot of this theme actually spawned from having this idea of using this piece for pillars, which actually quite coincidentally is something that Skystorm also came up with. And he actually also has some videos on his channel about how you can make some round pillars, but while his are actually quite large, and I really figured wouldn't be possible in a theme park scale obviously, I wanted to make some smaller ones, see if that's actually possible to work with them in a theme park scale, and I think these ones actually look pretty decent and are also really small enough and flexible enough, as long as you just place a couple together, but save them all into one. Well yeah, using control, save them all at the same time and duplicate them just to get a couple pillars on a grid like this, which makes things pretty easy, and it's pretty fast to do as well, but I'm actually really happy with how the final result is. There are just a couple of very small nitpicks that I do have to give. It's obviously impossible to actually get the golden ratio that classical buildings have with a grid system like that, or at least it's practically incredibly tough to do. It's probably possible if you work with many different buildings to get a golden ratio in there, but I obviously didn't want to take that effort and just keep it on the grid and more simple to control. And also, something which I did look back at, but by that time I already made all the pillars, so it's hard to really change that, is that they're a little bit thin. I would have liked to make them a bit more thick than they currently are. But aside from that, I'm actually really happy with how it turned out. And it didn't even take too much time to actually detail this thing. So next thing that I obviously wanted to do was add the architrave and the frieze, which are the horizontal roof supporting pieces which you have all of the decorations on the side just underneath the roof and above the pillars over there, which is going to be the majority really of the detailing of this building apart from the pillars. And I had a couple of ideas about it. Just like the pillars, they are pretty unconventional. Like, I really wanted to use the chimneys as bases for the pillars since they seem to be the best working thing. And I've tried a number of things for the tops of the pillars, but funnily enough, I actually think the little decoration of the pirates thing works best to sort of make the Corinthian pillars, which Corinthian pillars are the most fancy ones and the ones that you want to have in Roman very expensive and show-off buildings, which are the ones with all the leaves and details and the most sort of developed of all of the different pillars that you have, which is not that many, but I wanted to at least sort of emulate their look with the little pirate decorations on top of the pillars. It's obviously not exactly the same, and when you look at it very closely you can just see the pirates theme in there, but it's really what I figured worked best from a decent distance, which is probably what this thing is going to be best to look at from anyway. And the same really goes for the rest of the decorations on the building. I did have a lengthy fight with these little pointy bits on the bottom of the roof here, which took a very long time to get in the exact position that I wanted. Anybody who's tried to use shift and control to move objects to different locations probably know what I'm talking about, because it turns incredibly hard to get them into the right positions that you want, since you have to have your mouser on a surface which is perpendicular to the surface which you place the object on for it to not suddenly rotate and get into a completely different rotation than you needed, which makes it really hard to get the alignment exactly right. And here on the side of the building I just wanted to use the same little pirate decorations as on the top of the pillar. Not so much because it's a decoration that is really realistic, but because it's the overall look, color and texture which I wanted to have. Because if anything, because so much of this building is made out of just one piece, which is that one roof piece, that concrete roof piece which you're supposed to use for the edges of roofs, but yeah, whatever. It quickly turns into like all the same colors and you can't really tell the details apart, so I really wanted to get some different pieces in there which have some slightly different textures, so it at least looks a little bit more like you can actually see the details. That's why I just wanted to get those little pirate things in there, even though they don't really look that realistic from very close up. They're more as a sort of general color and texture that I wanted to use them, which I think you can definitely tell from a larger distance. They do look like some Roman mural-like carvings in the wall, which is what I really wanted to go for. And also in the Forum Romanum there are so many pillars with statues on them, which is something which I did want to in a way put into this part of the park, though instead of actually having cool Roman people on it, I'm pretty much forced to have parrots, because that's the pirate theme, and really the mermaid was way too large to put on there, and the Pirates King was incredibly way too large to put on there. So yeah, these are now just pillars with parrots on it. It's, again, really something which I wanted to go for in terms of shape and texture and the overall look, and something which, if you look closely to it, it's a little bit weird. But yeah, then again, this general area is much more so, I would reckon, than the Japanese area and Alpine area perhaps. A bit of an experiment with what you can actually do in the game, and I'm actually really happy with how it came out. I think the theme is a really good theme to try and get different uses out of different objects that we already have and get more used to the building system as we have it at the moment. So which is also something that Fluxtrons actually said in his latest video, which is also a really awesome video, but he worded it better than I actually can. But basically, anything I'm really doing in this alpha, or any of the other very early alpha versions of this game, isn't so much to make the best possible park, but really to just try and experiment and also get used to the building system. And that's also really one of the reasons why I wanted to do this theme, because it's so much fun to just work with all types of different objects to see what little details you can actually mix them into. So that was the main idea which went into this. And aside from the very much temple-like structure which I have as the station right now, I also did want to put up a wall in front of the brake run at the end there, which may also function as a good way to sort of camouflage the transfer track if I ever get into that, but I'm not entirely sure if I really want to. But that's something I'll see about in the future. And it's also a good way, I think, to make the temple come out a little bit more by just having some buildings which are slightly placed behind it and a little bit lower, and also give it more of that Forum Romanum feeling to it, which it's a plaza with a lot of temples around it and a lot of basilicas and so many buildings. You really have that layered feeling in the plaza, which is like so many different buildings and temples that the plaza almost feels like it's in some sort of valley with the almost mountain-like buildings around it, which is something that I obviously can't get into here because it just wouldn't be realistic for a theme park, and I'm already really pushing the budget that a theme park here would have. But yeah, I would like to experiment as well, but I sort of want to make this facade look as grand as I can really, and make it a bit similar to the Forum Romanum without actually placing any really huge buildings. So these are mostly going to be very flat, narrow decorations. This building in particular was actually inspired by Basilica Julia, which is one of these like very open, I think it's a marketplace, that's what I remember at least, but I might have that wrong, but it's a very open building with arches all around it. But since I obviously didn't want to make a building that large, and I really just wanted to make something which was visually similar to it when you look from the front, but aside from that doesn't really have any of the specific shape building characteristics really. I just wanted to get a small gallery in here with a couple of arches and a couple of pillars and some details, but aside from that it's really just an empty husk of a building over here, and really just there to be nice and has no other function really, and it's pretty small building otherwise. I still do want to build a couple more structures in future episodes, but I'm not entirely sure yet how I'll do that. I'll make them somewhat similar to these, but I obviously do want to try slightly different details with each building and see if I can use different objects just to make it mixed up a little bit. But I also don't want to build too many buildings. I'm really trying to go on the fine line between completely overdoing this area and really make it very, well, over-realistically grand, I would say, and making it a realistic theme park area, which is also something which I don't want to completely do, because I do want to just kind of take, well, you could say advantage of the fact that I don't really have to care about money over here and can just make things look as pretty as I can, basically. I mean, after all, it's still fantasy in the game, and this is still early alpha. And also I wanted to have this small area in between the paths not just seem like one big rocky pit, which is something that I may want to do, but since I don't have too many buildings around this plaza, I wanted to have the area underneath the path sort of contribute to a more urban style to the entire area. So instead of having rocks around the paths, I also wanted to have some very small hidden facades and some windows and building-like structures underneath the paths as well, which was a bit of just a random thing I felt like doing really. But in the end I am quite happy with how it works, and it definitely makes it all feel a lot more like it's one whole. Like, I really feel if I had rocks over here as well, and then actually had just buildings above the paths, you would really see that big contrast between just rocks and foliage underneath the paths and buildings above the paths. And now it just feels more like it's all part of one multi-layered, maybe a hillside structure with different buildings at different heights. Basically that type of idea, which is what I want to go for. Obviously Rome as well was built on a hill, so that's maybe a bit of an inspiration for it as well. The biggest difference that I would probably note between this and what it's inspired by though is that I did want to add a lot more foliage and leave more room open without buildings and be able to actually get some trees and bushes and flowers in there rather than filling everything with buildings. Because one of the things which I've already sort of feared at this point was that everything would end up looking similar. Even though I have these different little details and wall textures in there, and there is still some contrast within the buildings, they are very light generally, and that's something which I did try to counteract there by adding the brick walls wherever I could, really, as details or arches. But it's something which is really hard to fight with the objects which I pretty much needed to use to actually get this structure to be like this. And even looking back, I think it may be a little bit too much on the light side. Like, I do like how light it is. It's definitely got an aesthetic look to it, but I sort of want the foliage to counteract that very light color of the buildings. And I really feared if I would just have buildings around everywhere, it would not just be extensively over the top, but also be very hard to really tell them apart, and it'd be one big sea of marble pillars, which, while it's definitely something that the original Forum Romanum looked like in the end, it's not something that I really want to make in this context. Just want to have more foliage and gardens around here with the occasional Roman buildings and a couple of lanterns which are hanging by some stone pillars. I'm not really sure about them. I really hope at some point in the future, and definitely sort of do expect it as well, to get some more generic lamps which you can use to make different lamps, but much like people always did in Roller Coaster Tycoon 3, by combining the already available lamps with different custom scenery pieces or different lamps. It's already quite a lot of fun to actually combine different scenery pieces to make some almost custom lamps, really, which is something which I did want to do there, but really would have loved to have some more modern lamps in there. Though that's just wishful thinking. I do have to say, I do complain quite a lot about things that are not in the game, and I am definitely aware that this is an alpha, and that's just the kind of stuff that I like to talk about in these random streams of consciousness that the time-lapse commentaries pretty much are. But yeah, that's it for this time-lapse, though I do still have a small real-time part. So this is what the area currently looks like, plus a couple of trees which I added to make the thumbnail and decided to keep in there, otherwise the thumbnail would be pretty clickbait-ish. But yeah, what you see is what you get really here. There are a couple of things which I should really say though. It's definitely rough around the edges, still need to add some more scattered details around here to make it feel a little bit more alive, like some small barrels here and there, and you know, the good old random stuff that you can just scatter around to have some extra detail and make areas feel a little bit more alive. It's basically the bare bones and the spine structure, really, of the plaza which I have at the moment, and there are definitely some other things which I want to add. I still want to get some sort of queue going over here, run through the forest there, so that's why I'll need to remove the trees again to actually be able to get the rockwork underneath it and actually position them pretty well instead of just having them float around. And also I think some buildings over here, but I'm not quite sure, and probably a building over here as well. And when you go down here, I may want to also extend the Roman area a little bit, add some more normal houses rather than big villas or temples or things like that, and maybe also a triumphal arch, which is something which I may want to do because it's just a really cool idea, I think, and I've tried a couple of things with it and I think it may actually turn out very pretty in the end. But yeah, this is what I have at the moment, so thank you guys for watching. I'll pick it up next time, so see you guys then.